Yo, parish orphans and retrogrades. On today's episode of Rules for Retrogrades, I bring to you a special episode involved in the news. It's a current event. The Shroud of Turin is back in the news, and it is being vindicated. It's been vindicated scientifically. And my claim to you today is a big claim that the reportage of the vindication of the Shroud of Turin is far, far underreported. It's diminished. There's a mitigated version of the extent to which the Shroud of Turin has been vindicated in recent years. Now, I've wanted to do this show for a while. Even secular outlets are doing stories entitled, "Is this proof the Turin Shroud is real?" Scientists, with a question mark, scientists make startling discovery after analyzing cloth Jesus was buried in. And the fact of the case is that there's a very, very slight addition to the very, very compelling evidence that is gathered since the year 2000, which overturns the 1988 overturning of the veracity of the cloth. I remember being 7 years old in 1988, and my teacher saying, "Oh, it's a fake." Everyone was upset. There was radiocarbon dating in 1988, and it's quite the scandal. It looks rather like foul play in retrospect. There's almost no way to avoid saying it was foul play. They purposely took, we'll get to it all, a patch of the shroud that had been repaired in the 1400s, and they tested it. There's just one little piece of it. They divided it into three, and they made it look like they took it from three separate parts of the cloth. They're supposed to take it from seven. And they said, "Oh, look, it's the 1400s. It's a fake. Christians are fake. It's a fugazi." So that's been the story from 1988 to 2000. They started reimagining it in 2000. Now, over the next 17 years or so, the shroud was vindicated so much. Okay, so what I'm presenting now is basically the work of Father Robert Spitzer, who's presenting the work of these scientists. Spitzer's galaxy brain, high IQ, 150 IQ type of guy, Jesuit. Has some really great books that I've had for a long time as a trained philosopher. He also is no slouch in the science. He's a PhD, and he took on the Shroud of Turin kind of as a pet thing. He works with these doctors, Dr. Raymond Rogers, which is hilarious because it's Ray Rogers, Dr. Giulio Fonti. He really interfaces with them closely, and this is his presentation, Father Spitzer's, where he gathered all of the scientific evidence. It is unfathomably convincing, especially compared to what's even being reported this week in terms of the vindicating powers of the science for the shroud. This is Father Spitzer's presentation from 2017 Napa. So thanks, Father. If you're out there, if you hear this, I'm giving you full credit here. I am basically just repeating your PowerPoint presentation now. Real quick, the Shroud of Turin is a 14-foot linen cloth that Jesus' body was wrapped in by Joseph of Arimathea, who was a member of the Sanhedrin, one of the good guys in the Sanhedrin. Lots of even Grail mythology about Joseph of Arimathea and the knights. There's a lot there. The shroud itself is the most scientifically analyzed relic in the history of the world. It presents us with an anomaly, something that in several manners is unique in all of the world in terms of science or a substratum that is being studied by science, not just from a Christian point of view, from a secular, from a scientific, methodological point of view. It is utterly unique insofar as it is a 3D picture. We see subdermal contusions of Jesus, which represents a photographic negative image of a non-photographically sensitive linen cloth. It is the only, I repeat, the only photographic negative image of a non-photographically sensitive linen cloth. Now, you might be saying, if you're Catholic out there, what about the tilma of Guadalupe? Well, it's not that's not technically a photographic negative image on non-photographically sensitive linen. The tilma is remarkable because the color is non-elemental. The color on that cactus cloth called tilma is not actually on the cloth, the cactus cloth. It hovers 1/8 of a millimeter above it, like a hologram. They can't figure it out on the tilma. So yes, that seems similar, like a photographic negative image on non-photographically sensitive substrate, but it's not. It has the same kind of effect because cactus cloth is non-photographically sensitive, but the image isn't actually impressed there. Here, it's only the top fibril, the very topmost layer of like a cotton textile or a linen or whatever. Only the very top has the color in it. It's impossible to do that with crayon, marker, even if you have evidence of like EMP or atomic bursts where someone gets like blown against the wall, it goes all the way through. It would not just be on the fibril. So what you have is the light energy without the heat energy. We'll get to that at the end. But once again, it's also unique insofar as it is a three-dimensional image. We see things inside Jesus, once again, like an X-ray. It's notable that in the provenance of not only the shroud, but in the provenance of the entire iconography of Christ's face, his facial features, which, as Kanye West says, I'm not here to argue over his facial features, but they did change around 360 AD. They went from a Roman phenotypical man to a Semitic phenotypical man, and they all changed after that. And it has to do with the history of the shroud. The more important provenance for you to understand as it relates to this story is the provenance of the scientific testing of the shroud. Begin in 1978. There's a host of scientists who say this is absolutely real from a thermochemical point of view. It's Father Spitzer's work. From a physical point of view, meaning physics, what we know about Newtonian physics. From a medical point of view, coroner's reports, and from a photographic point of view, the team of 1978 scientists said this is absolutely real. And more important than that, though it's hard to believe that there could be anything more important than authenticating it, they set out protocols, very specific protocols, for an eventual radiocarbon dating of this, because the church always allows the relics to be radiocarbon dated. The protocols set out that there needed to be 7 samples taken, spaced out somewhat evenly, maybe 3 on this side, 3 on this side, and 1 in the middle, sent to 7 labs. They said, when we radiocarbon date this thing, we want 7 samples sent to 7 different labs to keep it to keep our margin of errors absolutely low, to keep it absolutely objective, send them out to non-Catholic scientists, 7 different labs, 7 different samples. Fast forward a decade, 10 years, 1988, the year of the radiocarbon dating. I was 7 years old. I think I was in Mrs. Coates' class in 2nd grade. And I remember my teacher coming in. It was either Mrs. Coates, 2nd grade, or Mrs. Black's 3rd grade in Catholic school, saying, well, this is very disappointing. The shroud's a fake. They just radiocarbon dated it to the 1400s. And here's how objective it was. So there can't be any pushback. It was sent out to 3 separate labs. I hadn't understood then that from 1978, they said it should be 7 labs. They sent it out to 3 labs, 3 different labs. So it sounds pretty objective. It sounds pretty damning. And they all said the same thing, that this comes from the carbon dating. 3 pieces of the shroud is what they said. This is a lie. This is a lie. 3 pieces of the shroud sent to 3 different labs, and they're all from the 1460s. Late 1300s, probably 1460s. Which the church still kind of ran the world then. This is the way idiot left, IQ 95s think of world history. So this stands to kind of the IQ 95 Hollywood illiterates conception of who ran the world in 1460. What you don't know is that there's this whole other provenance of the scientific testing of the shroud. In 2000, there was a scientist named Raymond Rogers who had sticky tapes of cotton, sticky tapes of fibrils from the shroud that were immediately next to the place on the shroud, the quote unquote 3 places on the Shroud of Turin where the 1988 carbon dating samples came from. Here's the thing. They found cotton in the fibrils. There was no cotton in Israel. That's fishy. Also, they looked back into the radiocarbon dating procedure that had been used 12 years before in 1988. And here's what they found. Yes, there were 3 separate substrates sent out to 3 separate labs. Okay, it's not 7, but it's still 3. That's pretty good, right? That's what they're saying at the time. I didn't even know it was supposed to be 7. But it wasn't 3 legitimate samples taken from 3 different spots on the shroud. Absolutely corruptly. They took the sample from one part of the shroud in 1988, cut it into thirds, and sent it to 3 labs, not 7, but 3, to make it look objective. More damning still, what they did in 1988 is they found a repaired patch on the shroud. This is what you're dealing with when you deal with secularists in the world. Liars. A repaired patch from a fire in France called the Fire of Chambray, where nuns in the 1450s or 1460s repaired that portion of the shroud because it had been singed slightly. They purposely pulled just one sample from there, cut it into thirds, sent it to 3 labs, and they say, look, it's 1460. It was a turkey shoot. It was a setup. It was a conspiracy. And now we know this. And they're still not reporting it in the secular news. The secular news you think is being magnanimous because that was Daily Mail. Like, oh, they said maybe it's real. That's underreportage. That's like damning with faint praise, if you know that expression. And they're not telling the provenance of the corrupt haters of Christianity who set this thing up. They already knew this is the repaired part of the shroud. It's from the middle 1400s. Let's cut that into thirds as if they're from all over the shroud. Let's carbon date that. It comes back with they knew it was going to be dated to the middle 1400s because carbon dating is real. It works. And then they sold this pack of lies to the world. I'm not exaggerating to you, parish orphans and retrogrades. I always say Michael Knowles says he was an atheist by his confirmation in 8th grade. I was an atheist far before that. This is my earliest memory. This could be it. 2nd or 3rd grade, either Mrs. Coates or Mrs. Black's class. I remember how the teacher entered the room and said, well, that's it for the Shroud of Turin. And I was so crushed. I think this is the beginning of my atheism. As best as my memory suits. Oh, the church is running a scam on people? No, as Michael Knowles says, it's all real. The scammers are those who say it's not real. So this 1980, the testing in 1988 was fraudulent. They should actually look into this, like prosecution. 2000, Raymond Rogers takes his sticky tapes, shows cotton in the fibrils. This can't be the real deal. I mean, I guess maybe there was cotton in the 1400s, but there was no cotton in Israel, and yet there's dyed gum. There's a dye in there with gum dyed mordant from the 15th century that they did not have in Israel. And so there's basically proof that the fibrils were taken from different spots, from one spot on the shroud that did not correspond with what the 1978 protocols required. Hey, you're supposed to take it from 7 different places. They took it from one place dyed with gum mordant, cotton there that wouldn't come from Israel. And so starting in 2000, Raymond Rogers' conclusion is this is different. We need to retest the shroud. We need to retest the shroud. And I think that was the time in which, 12 years after the 1988 test, he said, okay, we know this is from the fire of Chambray. We know where they took this one sample. It's essentially corrupt. Let's redo some scientific dating tests. Starting in 2000, 4 new scientific dating tests were run. Ray Rogers ran one of these. I can't get over the name. A vanillin test, which is essentially a test which, when you're dealing with linens, involves the decompositional rate at the level of a trace element that is even supposed to be there in ancient linens. So the vanillin test shows this thing's way, 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 way older than 600 years. The vanillin test shows more like 2,000 years old. The second test was by an Italian scientist named Giulio Fanti. And it was a transformed infrared spectroscopy test. And it essentially compares not the decay rate, but what's left, comparison to other linens, other ancient linens. That's what the transformed infrared spectroscopy test is. That's number 2. It also showed, like Raymond Rogers' vanillin test, that the shroud is about 2,000 years old. We'll give you the once you compress all the data and you give us the midpoint of the predictions of the age of the shroud from all 4 of these tests, it ends up at 50 AD, give or take 200 years, with 96% certitude. The third test is also Giulio Fanti's Raman laser test. It's a spectroscopic test that is less vulnerable to carbon absorption. So it's considered a better test than Giulio Fanti, a more accurate test than Giulio Fanti's transformed infrared spectroscopy test. And I obviously don't know exactly what these tests entails. I'm giving you the rundown. The fourth test was the mechanical tension and compressibility man. So it's a stretchability before breaking test that you can apply to any linen. And the long and the short is these 4 tests say none of them came back with the result that the shroud was only 600 years old. Now, there's so much more. All of them say about 2,000 years old, midpoint of the average of all 4 is 50 AD plus or minus 200 years. But 50 AD is, 15 years off. So that's exactly what you'd expect to see. 96% certitude. And now I'm going to turn you, as Father Robert Spitzer does in his 2017 Napa Valley presentation, to 3 external references